Time slip is a phenomenon that causes unexplained and unexpected time travel. There are many reputable people who claim to have encountered a time slip, and the following story is about two Englishmen in the early 50s who encountered something once in Greece that haunted them for the rest of their life because they had no explanation for what they'd experienced. The following time slip event took place on March the 15th and 16th in 1954 in Greece, where two young men by the name of Colin Sandhurst and Reginald Renwick were on holiday. One day, Colin had a strong urge to visit the famous historic site of Olympia. Initially, Reginald was not as keen as Colin to visit the historic location, but had nevertheless agreed to accompany him. The following day, they boarded the train to Olympia, which in the early 50s was just a small village. After arriving in Olympia, they then booked into a hotel that was as small like a cottage, and after a few days, asked the owner of the hotel where they should visit, and he suggested they go up into the mountains, where they would get an excellent view of the picturesque valley below. He said that it was not a difficult climb, and if it was a clear day, they would get a beautiful view of the ocean. They took the hotelier's advice, and the following day headed for the hills, and when they arrived at the summit, they found there were no boulders, rocks, trees, or houses. Instead, there was flat grassland as far as they could see. After admiring the scenery, they then headed to the opposite side of the mountain, which was totally different, as they came upon old rusty farm machinery and an old cattle shed, but there was nobody present. They continued their walk and after a few metres came to the edge of a mountain, which was extremely steep and overlooked a valley far below. Initially, they could not get a clear view of the valley, as it was surrounded by mist that appeared to cover the valley like a white cloth. Then all of a sudden, the mist parted in a straight line, and it was as if somebody had cut it with a knife. The clouds then parted, where one side went to the left and the other went to the right. But what baffled them was that there was no wind or even a breeze that could have caused the clouds to part in that strange way. The valley below was now crystal clear, and from their high vantage point gave them an amazing view. They observed a building made of wood that stood in the centre of a large circle of either light sand or soil. Both Colin and Reginald could hear the sound of children singing, while they appeared to be chanting, and thought maybe it could have been coming from the wooden building, as it looked like a school or church. They continued to look down on the valley, and on the outside of the large sandy area, they could see houses, and next to the houses were rows of huts with flat-top roofs. Between each row of huts were roads. Several of the huts must have had fires burning, as smoke was coming up in a perfect spiral, as there was no wind to blow the smoke away. However, after viewing this idyllic scenery for a few minutes, they thought it strange that everything was perfectly still, and there was nobody walking around. There was no movement whatsoever, which was even stranger because on checking their watches, it was 10 a.m. in the morning, and people and animals should have been out and about. For some unknown reason, Colin quickly turned his head around, followed by Reginald, and standing behind them was a young man on a horse who was very close to them. The young man looked about 20, and he was dressed in a long-sleeved white shirt with a dark waistcoat, and on his head was a large wide-brimmed hat that appeared to be made of leather. The young man then lifted his head to his mouth and appeared to have a cigarette between his fingers. The young man spoke very softly, but they could not understand him, as he was obviously speaking in his native tongue. Colin then looked across to Reginald, who said, "I think he wants us to light his cigarette. Throw me your matches." Colin then studied the young man's horse, or what he believed was a pony, as it was small. The pony was light grey with brown patches with a rock on its back. What was confusing Colin was that the horse was extremely close, yet he could not smell anything. It gave off no animal odour. Colin then looked back at the young man, whose hand was no longer near his face, and on closer observation he could see it was not a cigarette in his hand but a piece of brown paper that looked to be the size of a cigarette. What was also troubling Colin was how come when the young man and his pony came so close did they not hear him approaching, and they did not make a sound. They appeared to come out of nowhere. At this stage, Colin was feeling a bit concerned, and something was telling him that they should move away, and he said to Reginald they should head back to the hotel. They slowly backed away, leaving the young man and his horse behind, and after they had moved about 20 metres, Colin looked back to see if the young man was still there, but to his utter amazement, found the young man and his horse were no longer there. They'd completely vanished. He looked around and saw that the land around where the young man had just been standing was flat and open grassland, so there was nowhere for him to have disappeared in such a short time, and he also looked around the old shed, but he was nowhere to be seen. Reginald suggested that they must have gone down the mountainside, but they realised, well, that was impossible because no man or horse could have survived going down such a steep gradient. When they arrived back at the hotel, they approached the owner and asked him the name of the village they'd just observed from the mountain. The owner looked at them confused and said there was no such village in the valley. Reginald did not seem convinced by the owner's response, and the following day he left the hotel at 9:30 a.m. and did not return until 4:30 p.m. He told Colin that he'd walked back up to the mountain to the exact spot where they'd been the day before. To his astonishment, he said there were no longer any houses, mud huts, roads, schools or churches at all. Everything they'd observed the day before had completely vanished. Today, both men are in their 80s, and Colin felt he needed to go back to the mountain to see for himself, but Reginald convinced him that there was nothing to be seen. The only explanation Colin had was that both he and Reginald had encountered a time slip whilst they were on the mountain in Olympia. How else could those wooden structures and mud-built dwellings that appeared to them from a different period of time just disappear? Another major factor for people who encounter time slips is that they always comment on the silence that surrounds them, and on many occasions there are never any people, just buildings. The sight of the young man and his horse adds extra mystery to this strange event, and what would have happened if they had attempted to shake hands with the young man or pat the horse, and what was on the piece of paper that it held up to his face, and when he spoke, what was he actually saying to them?